For our COBT viewers and listeners, it's Maynard, Mike, and Arjun with a dear friend, Dr. Stephen Koonin. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. We've gotten to know him over the years. I think we first met him after he wrote his book, Unsettled. You may remember he was the Undersecretary for Technology and Science at the DOE. He's done many things in his accomplished career, but he's a good friend, and he's a real leader when it comes to energy thinking. We've gotten lucky this week because we had planned to visit with him, but he also just wrote an article that was in the Wall Street Journal, an op-ed talking about what comes next with energy, and in particular, what Trump could do to put a positive, a lot of positive momentum behind a potential withdrawal from the Paris Accords. You don't hear that angle very much. And so, Dr. Koonin, we're excited to visit with you and talk about all the exciting things happening in energy.
Great to be here and talking virtually and talking with you. It's always a pleasure.
Well, you're too kind to us, sir. You know, the other thing that's kind of fun, Dr. Koonin, is this is your third visit with us.
So,
okay. You know, we always love repeat customers. It must mean something good.
You know, like any professor, you give me a platform and I'll talk and talk. So, but it's just great to be talking about energy, which is so interesting and so nuanced, and particularly with people who are deeply knowledgeable about the subject.
Well, thank you, sir. Mike, before we jump in with Dr. Koonin, you and Arjun, what's on you guys' minds to tee us up today?
Yeah, Maynard, you mentioned that Dr. Koonin has been on 3 times, and I figured, you know what? Let's go back and see the last time he came on, where prices are going, commodity prices, equity prices. And so I thought I'd do what it was April 19th of 2020.
Do you have Dr. Koonin's market predictions? Are we going to go over those?
No.
No, oh, that's right. We couldn't pin him down.
Exactly. But it was 2022, April 19th. And here's where we've gone. We've gone from $100 oil down to $70 oil, so roughly $30 a barrel. Natural gas has gone from roughly $6.50 to $3.25, so cut in half. The funny thing is the XLE, which is the energy spider, is up 16%. So in that time frame when commodity prices got cut quite dramatically, we actually had the energy sector go up. Now, the S&P over that time frame is up around 45%, so just put that in where it should be. Bitcoin's up 165% since then. The 10-year has gone from 2.9% to 4.4%, and energy as a percent of the S&P has gone from 4.2% to 3.2%. So hasn't exactly been a fantastic commodity tape, but energy equities in general are up over that time frame. Now, as it relates to the last week, and maybe some points that we'd want to hit on. The 10-year bond last week was up about 25 basis points to 4.4%. That's the highest it's been since Trump was elected president. We had a hot PPI last week, inline CPI, and so most people are expecting that the Fed's on Wednesday. It's almost unanimous, total consensus that they're going to raise a quarter, and they're going to lower it by a quarter point on Wednesday. So, I think from the standpoint of equity markets are kind of going sideways right now because guess what? They're also laser focused on what's going to happen on Wednesday, but really more focused on what Powell's going to say about future interest rate policy, especially with Trump coming in. So he's going to be peppered with a lot of those questions for sure. I'd say from an energy sector standpoint, we're down a couple percent in energy last week, but I think the biggest story last week probably was everyone keyed on to what was going on in Exxon's update call. If you recall, the previous week, Chevron basically lowered their CapEx guidance. Exxon pretty much was a little bit more aggressive in their CapEx guidance. They talked about getting to 5.4 million barrels equivalent by 2030. That kind of shocked a lot of people, and so they're leaning in. The other thing they talked about is basically maybe building a large power plant, natural gas power plant. They're talking to customers. They've got the land sited. And so this whole, molecules and electrons, really kind of intertwining with each other. I think we've heard from Chevron. We've heard from basically Exxon. We saw ProPetro last week stock go up 18%. They announced 110 megawatts in distributed generation. So this is a continued theme. And, what I'd like to leave with you guys with right now is everyone's been talking about the energy transition. And one of the things that, I've been focused on is the energy convergence. I think that's what we're going to be talking about over the next 12, 18 months, 2 years. And so I'm really happy to see Dr. Koonin with us, and I'd love to explore these issues with him.
Arjun, what would you throw in?
Maynard, one of the big themes that just came up in a big Bloomberg article last night, and we've seen it for the last few months, has been the challenges Germany's facing, and a lot of challenges with deindustrialization, the high energy costs they're facing, and I think a lot of challenging energy policies that they took, whether it's retiring nuclear, obviously previously being a little addicted perhaps to Russian gas that got cut off, and then perhaps an overemphasis on a singular solution of renewables to somehow replace, again, especially nuclear and inevitably the Russian gas that was cut off. And I just want to take a step back. My training as a Wall Street analyst is that you make calls. And when you make these calls, you have to judge, did I do well? Did I do poorly? And we've tried to stick to that as best as we can with our Super Spike publication. So we don't have mercifully buy, hold, sell ratings on individual stocks, but we have tried to go back and say, what are the themes we've gotten right? What have we gotten wrong? We take some pride that we've had a lot of issues with sort of the energy transition as commonly defined that I wrote about last week. And I think we feel good that the world, I think, is coming towards our view that energy abundance and reliability are things you have to focus on. But I'm going to write in this coming week about some of the tactical calls that we talked about for 2024. And I think I got about half of them wrong. And so we're going to judge, what are the calls I got right? What are the calls I got wrong? The ones we got wrong, why? What did we miss? And this kind of thing. Will that same type of perspective occur for those that have been saying all we need is renewables, and that countries like Germany can somehow retire baseload capacity, nuclear and coal, and make do with only solar and wind overwhelmingly? And of course, in their case, they went to backup and coal. Will we see the same kind of learn from policymakers, from academics, from all those folks who said net zero by a round number year is all that matters? And we're not arguing that environmental goals aren't important. They are important. But when people forget why we use energy and that we all need it 24/7, 365, and you see some of the challenges that are going on in Germany today by having had some, what I'm going to call very unfortunate energy policies, where will the lessons be learned be happening? It's easy to say, well, voters are going to vote out politicians who didn't support these causes. That's true. But what about the broader academic community? What about the broader institutions out there like the IA and others that have really put front and center net zero by 2050 is all that matters, as I would interpret a lot of their sayings? And I just ask, on Wall Street, we try to hold ourselves to standards. I at least try and say, here's what I got right, but here's where I got wrong. Next week's post is going to be a whole bunch of things I got wrong. I would just suggest, I think this is needed on a broader scale. And it's going to be up to people and institutions to frankly hold themselves accountable. With that, Maynard, really excited to have Dr. Koonin here, and I'll turn it back over to you.
That's a really fun getting off place, Arjun, is because it feels like it is consensus, sort of, that some things haven't been working and we need to course correct-ish. I'm waffling with a lot of this language, but wouldn't it be neat if we sat down and really talked about the poor choices versus the good ones and tried to learn? Dr. Koonin, I mentioned you have an interesting article that just came out in the Wall Street Journal, and this was something that was on your mind, I think, when we saw you this summer, just talking about what's the next way to think about what the world is trying to do? How do we create a different, I guess, dare I say, paradigm, but how do we create a different way of thinking about all these objectives that has viability and buy-in? But it's a long way of saying welcome.
Good. It's of course great to be talking with you guys, as I said. Let me start by reminding us about the energy trilemma that we often talk about, namely reliability, affordability, and clean. And while we often talk about three legs of the stool is in fact tilted, because in fact that reliability and affordability come well before clean. If you don't have energy, as we well know, your life is miserable. If you can't afford it, it's not quite as miserable, but it makes other parts of your life miserable because you run out of money. So I think the world has awakened to the fact that, gee, it would be nice to clean energy up, both locally, which we're more or less able to do in the developed world, but also globally in the sense of greenhouse gas emissions. that takes a back seat to other considerations. And when people started talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions 20 years ago, we had the phrase contraction and convergence, right? Which meant that the developed world was going to reduce its emissions and hence standard of living, while the developing world was going to come up and use more energy. And of course, anybody who looks at that and knows anything about energy would say there are some fundamental problems with that. And I'm sure certainly Arjun and maybe you, Maynard, 20 years ago said there are some real issues here, that perhaps this is not going to happen as easily as everybody thinks. And the real issues are the developing world. 6 billion people don't have enough energy. They're going to do whatever they need to do because the stool is tilted. And those of us in the developed world, energy systems change only very slowly for fundamental reasons. And so, Arjun, for every person who said net zero is the only thing that matters, I think there were a number of us, maybe not quite as vocal, who said, you ain't going to be able to do that for some fundamental reasons. And in fact, if you look at the UN emissions gap reports over the last couple years, one of them is entitled Broken Record. Emissions hit new highs, and the world keeps talking. And the second one is entitled Hot Air, More of the Same. And so we talk about it a lot in the forum of the UN COPs, but in fact, nothing's happening very quickly for fundamental reasons that are pretty easy to understand.
So I was thinking, Dr. Koonin, there's so many ways we could go with this. I was struck by this a few years ago. John Hess said at a CIRA conference, I wish we had more business people in government. So it wasn't a comment about Democrats or Republican, it was a comment about who's in government, who's making policy choices, and what informs their views. And one thing that is interesting, particularly in the energy context, is we have Doug Burgum, we have Chris Wright, there are others who are going to be part of this. There is a business-minded focus that's coming, and I'm just trying to describe that neutrally, but that seems to be a part of this. Is that going to help? Because the reason I start there is it seems like one of the biggest problems, besides just the physics, which were huge, was you just couldn't pay for it all. It didn't work. It didn't, right? So what do you think the business mindedness of what's coming, how will that help us or hurt us?
Yeah. So that's a wonderful question. I know Chris pretty well, and I know Doug some, and they are superb business folks. And what I like about the business-oriented mindset is that they're very fact-driven and quantitative. You can't build a business the way those guys and others have done unless you pay attention to the facts and the numbers. But I would caution, having been in government for a couple years, government is not a business. And I think if you try to run it like that, you're going to run into trouble. One of the biggest differences is that there are so many different constituencies you have to deal with when you make a big move. I'll give you an example. Academia is the same way. It moves slowly. When I got into BP in 2005 or so, I was so impressed that John Brown was able to wipe out a whole division of BP with the stroke of a pen. And, the thought of doing that as an academic, wow, I wish I could have, but you can't. And government is the same way. If you say, I'm going to change X, there are 50 different voices that will stand up and say, don't you dare do that. And so there's a lot more working of the crowd that will have to go on if we're going to move at the speed of business in government.
What do you, just because we're in and around it, so I'll go ahead and ask you, but this Department of Government Efficiency, we're way off the rails here. But that's another strain of thinking that has entered the discussion that, to your point, whether it's governments just, they don't think or work that way, but we're going to try at least to think a little bit different. Any take on what DOGE could mean for this discussion?
They'll come up with, I'm sure, some quantitatively sensible things. How material it'll be is a different issue. Remember that only, I think, 26% of the federal government is discretionary. The rest is mandated transfer payments, and you can't touch those without an even bigger firestorm erupting, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and so on. So I think they'll come up with some things that would be great in a perfect world, but the world is not perfect. But the upside is it'll start some interesting discussions that may have some effect on our deficits.
One would be sort of another angle, which is just intellectual honesty, right? And you mentioned the comments around you can't build a business that's not based on facts. You shouldn't build policies that aren't based on facts either. It seems like there's been a cultural shift towards we need to be able to call things what they are, even if that bothers people, because if we don't, we're going to make bad decisions and that will really bother people. I don't, that's crazy simplistic, but do you think the world is getting better? Your book, Unsettled, it got a lot of reaction, a lot of pushback. Are we getting better at talking about these things without, and doing so factually without yelling at each other?
Yeah. I think it's a mixed bag. Scientists and engineers are, at their best, are pathological truth tellers. And that, I've been thinking, it does not mix well at all with politics, which is the heart of shading, omitting factual information. And so I think somebody who is, for example, the science advisor or other science positions in government, where you start to interface with policy, you've got to swallow your truth a little bit, or at least tell the truth, but then expect that the decision makers may not go in the way that you think the facts warrant. On the other hand, I think in some instances, and energy is getting there, the hard reality is manifesting itself. And you just need to look at what's been going on in Europe, for example, where it has been afactual or maybe even anti-factual policy discussion. You can't evade the facts. It's like gravity. And eventually people will and are getting more realistic. Also true here in the US. So it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, Dr. Koonin, appreciate you being here. One of the things that's come across to me, after listening to the Exxon call, is I'm saying that Guyana, on a per capita basis, is the fastest growing GDP in the world. And it just shows you that, energy, traditional energy can lift people out of poverty, and we should be thinking more about that than, net zero goals. I guess my question would be is like, over the last 4 or 5 years, it seems like sentiment has changed quite dramatically. And I would say a lot of that sentiment has to do with some of these big tech companies realizing, okay, AI is coming around. You know what? They're going after a business, right? It's not about saving the planet as it is building that business. And so maybe talk about those type companies getting on board with energy for all, energy transition, stuff of that, and energy convergence. How that's changed, how you see that change, where you think that's going in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I was impressed when I saw an opinion piece by Eric Schmidt about a month and a half ago. He otherwise thinks I'm the devil for having written the book. I understand, but he says it's okay to burn gas because AI is going to save the planet, and of course he's going to run the AI on gas. Um, Look, energy is just so essential to everything we do that you cannot put constraints on it and say, I'm not going to burn hydrocarbons because of some vague climate threat. It just takes precedence, the reliability and affordability. With respect to the hyperscalers, the big data companies, what is going to happen, I believe, is that they'll build gas, they'll burn gas. You can get a CCGT plant up in what, couple years, 3 years. They need the energy now, so they're going to do that. And I think on a longer time scale, maybe twice that, it'll be small modular reactors of some kind. So that'll be a great boost and development opportunity for the SMRs. And frankly, the extra gas they're going to burn is not going to be a big deal. Let me just say one other thing about energy needs during development. You mentioned Guyana. I haven't looked at them specifically, but for all the developing countries, energy use per capita increases steadily and universally with GDP per capita. The slope is about 4 megajoules per dollar. All right, so your GDP goes up by $1, your energy use per capita goes up by 4 megajoules. And one of the things that fascinates me currently is, where did that 4 megajoule number come from? Why is it 4, not 40.4? I don't know, but it's true in just about every country. So I'm working with some folks to try to understand why that slope is what it is.
Dr. Koonin, maybe I'll jump in here. And one of the themes from your book, Unsettled, I hear this from my father, who I know you know. He'll be happy to know we're talking. He's a physicist. And his line to me is always, you have to have a questioning attitude. That is the right mindset by which you approach problems. You try and learn. You learn from your mistakes. You learn from the knowledge you gain. And I heard that very much in your book. Yet the understanding around climate from the scientific community, and please correct me if you disagree with any of this, but there's been a politicization of it. And I can't quite tell, is that just academia? Do we just need more scientists? There's a handful like yourself who kind of, I would say, have retained that questioning attitude. But how did, it seems perplexing to me, having grown up in a family of scientists, that there seems to have been a politicization to such a degree around climate. And I honestly don't understand it. I can understand politicians perverting things in a certain way. I can even understand Wall Street people like myself perverting things to support our cause. I do not understand how scientists have gotten here, but maybe it hasn't been politicized, but I think you understand what I'm getting at here.
Yeah, I know I do. And, I'm trained, as most scientists are, and you absorbed it maybe by osmosis from your dad. Question everything, all right? Listen, check the facts, check the data, what's plausible, and so on. That's rare in modern society, that skeptical, questioning attitude, in part because people don't have the time. It takes a lot of time, but also because these subjects are complicated. Climate is as complicated as energy is. And when you mix the two of them together, it's terribly complicated. And one of the things I think we need to be doing, those of us who have some understanding of one or both of those subjects, is to work to try to get the facts across to the general public. You can do it, you can try social media. I haven't done it, but people do. Short films, longer films. Scott Tinker's done some great films on energy, books. I think as energy problems become more evident because of instabilities due to renewables or costs, bans on internal combustion engines, people are going to start to pay a lot more attention to the facts and ask, why are we doing this? Really? Is it so dire? Is the climate really broken? Is it going to make a difference if I recycle my trash or whatever it is that they want to do? So I'm a great believer in, reality in the end asserting itself.
How did we get here with the scientific community? My father worked at Bell Laboratories, which, while it was part of AT&T, was run in a very much of an independent, pure research. We're not going to worry about commercialization. We just do fundamental, original research. Is it that most science is now done in the university setting, which themselves have started to skew one way on the political spectrum? How did we get to where
Yeah.
science became politicized as it has?
I would distinguish between the science and scientists who are doing the science and the public representation of the science. And when I talk to working scientists in climate, I find them quite honest and sensible. I just give you an example. I gave a talk over the summer in which a prominent climate scientist, one of the country's great experts, with whom I have disagreements, but he came up afterward and said, Steve, your attitude about the science is pretty much where mainstream climate science is. All right. Where it gets corrupted is when the institutions, the IPCC, the national academies, I'm sad to say, the National Climate Assessment, where they talk to the policymakers. And that's where the corruption happens. And as I showed in the book, and anybody can see, if you compare what's being said publicly versus what's in the back of the reports, there's this very disappointing disconnect.
So, Dr. Koonin, I was thinking about your that exchange. One thing that was interesting, for instance, in the IRA was, and there's a lot of talk now about the IRA and what's going to happen to the IRA, but there was never, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, there was never a rollout to the American public of, this is the problem, these are the choices, this is the choice we're recommending, this is what we're going to spend, and this is what we hope to get. A handful of, almost like the Ross Perot, I'm going to do 10 PowerPoint charts. So now we're at a new inflection point where we've realized, okay, we need to modify the current program. Would you, and I know you're a scientist, not a politician, but we do need to explain to the world of what's going on, at least certainly the American public. Why is there no, or maybe tell me this is crazy, Trump, 10 slides, power costs by state, spending, choices, flavors, example of a couple of other countries, a little bit of national security, therefore we're recommending this. Do you think we might see something like that? When did we lose the Rose Garden Oval Office speech that told the rest of us what's going on?
I love the idea. And in fact, if you read the op-ed, that's the first thing I recommend that Trump do. Three things. And the first one is a fulsome explanation of why he's pulling out, which has got both energy components to it, science components to it, national security, and so on, and how we need to do this better. An honest discussion with the American people would be lovely, but certainly the current and the administration that we have right now does not want that to happen. I have long tried to get at least adversarial discussion of the science underway, and there's been tremendous resistance to that on the part of the scientific establishment as well as the political establishment. But maybe the new administration and the withdrawal from Paris is a great example to have, let's say, a national commission. That's how we address big issues sometimes, bipartisan national commission on the science and the options for responding to the situation we're in right now.
Well, thank you for bringing this back to your editorial. Do you mind, let's just pause and let's just really hit on that. Maybe take us through your key points, and we'll attach it when we send out this podcast.
Right. The framing is, there are arguments about staying in or withdrawing from the Paris Accord. But if you're going to withdraw from the Accord, there are positive things that can be done to actually benefit humanity and the planet. The first is, as I said, to give a fulsome explanation about why he's withdrawing. And that might also precipitate an emperor's new clothes moment for the EU, let's say. I know privately many politicians in Europe are starting to want to crawl back or climb down from the ambitious goals. As you know, decarbonization has roiled the political landscape in Europe tremendously. So it may be an opportunity for them to weigh in as well and says, hey, wait a second, let's think this thing through better. So that's the first thing. Second thing is to elevate the importance and perhaps start an initiative on energy poverty. I know this is something, for example, Chris Wright feels very strongly about. Energy for all. I think for your audience, it's well known that most of the world doesn't have adequate energy. And if US were to exercise leadership, make a moral call to let's provide energy to everybody independent of the source, that would have several positive benefits. One, of course, is to improve the lives of a lot of people. The second is it would be a counter to China, who's been moving in through the Belt and Road Initiative into national energy infrastructures in the developing world. It would provide a market for US energy. We've got so much gas that we can give to the world. And for US energy technologies, it would strengthen institutions in developing countries, making them ready to be able to deploy cleaner technologies as it comes along. So all kinds of good things if we'd sought a program energy for all. And then finally, double down or redouble efforts on demonstrating emissions-light technologies. I think most people understand we're not going to reduce emissions unless there's a technology solution. And I like small modular reactors, better batteries, I think merit particular attention. But subsidies and mandates that are forcing technologies that are ineffective or immature are just folly. And you see that again, heat pumps in Germany or the UK, for example, or we will see internal combustion engine bans here in the US come a cropper for exactly those reasons. So 3 things: explain factually why he's pulling out, start energy for all, and redouble the R&D efforts for emissions-light technologies. I think all of that can give a very productive spin on withdrawal from the Paris Accord.
So on that, I was just, Arjun touched on it. You touched on Europe as well, Dr. Koonin. Do you think that what has been going on in Europe is very concerning? I think when you were last with us, I guess we were about 2 months into the Ukraine war. But what is happening to European industry and competitiveness and standard of living is very worrisome. And the things that could happen from there are even worse, perhaps. How do we grab our German friends? I'll just pick them because they're the heart of Europe. How do we grab them when we say, we love you, we need you how can we help you? How do we go on the road and help a situation like that?
Yeah, I wish I knew. Maybe just 2 points. When people in government sometimes ask me, what should we do about energy, climate? I say, look at what Germany's doing and do the exact opposite. And
that's sort of like George on Seinfeld. I think, it worked perfect. It's a great advice.
Yeah. And, I have many colleagues in Germany, longtime friends, and I find their passivity or reluctance to engage with the facts a little bit strange. And maybe it's something in the German psyche still, guilt from what happened 80 years ago, perhaps. I don't know. But again, I think reality will eventually assert itself. The question is, how far down will they go, and does it become irreparable? I hope not. And it's also not only the Germans, of course. It's the French, the Scandinavians. They're all just different shades of the same problem.
There was this interesting story recently about, or commentary around the Norwegians have built electric interconnects with the rest of the continent. And they did so, coming from a position of they were had plenty of power, excess energy. And now those other countries have done such a poor job taking care of their energy needs. They're driving up Norwegian electricity prices, and there's talk about severing.
Yeah.
These are
I saw that.
stories.
Yeah, I mean, just a little more detail on the story, probably the same one you saw. Germany and Northern Europe generally has been hit by a couple of Dunkelflauten over the last couple of weeks. So no wind, no solar, and so they're tapping into the Scandinavian hydropower, and that has roiled the prices of electricity in the spot market. Somebody showed a wonderful map of the spot prices, and they're up 10 times or more what they are ordinarily. So I think Scandinavia is mad because of the volatility as much as the level of the price itself.
So I mentioned up front, you're out at Stanford. So many amazing things happening at Stanford in California in tech. I mean, it is a fabulous place. What do you notice around the energy conversation going on? Because that's another part of the world that has made some choices that have not, they've been a little controversial.
Yeah. On the campus has made, as you may know, a big push in energy and climate. The Door School for Sustainability. The founding dean is Arun Majumdar, a former colleague from DOE. And I think, it is proper for the university to be researching new energy technologies, certainly, and trying to understand climate better. Where I have a problem with what's going on at the university is the ideology and one-sidedness that has come along with that. I'm perfectly happy in Hoover, but I don't think there's much chance at all for me to give a presentation in the broader campus. They just don't want to hear what I think are just factual discussions. California more broadly, it's again somewhat disconnected from reality. I hear the governor of the PUC talk about the electrical system, and I just can't understand why the facts don't have a bigger voice in the discussion. California has the second highest statewide residential rates. It's I think 33 cents a kilowatt hour. Only Hawaii at 44 is higher, and the lowest state is something like Utah at 15 or thereabout cents a kilowatt hour. So people seem okay with it, green leadership and so on.
So it feels like we're all waiting to see exactly how the new administration tilts spending and policies and the dialogue and leadership around things like the Paris Accords. We have a sense of it. And one of them is, you mentioned it, pulling dollars from subsidies and or mandates and or other spending and pushing it into more basic research. Not exactly what you said, but something along those lines.
Yeah.
How in your experience, because that's something that feels like everybody gets on board with, everybody, this spending on basic science. What's your experience with how effective that spending is, or how do you make it more effective if you're going to fund basic research? What are some rules of the road there?
Yeah, I'm going to just go back first to the previous premise, pulling money out of subsidies and mandates, and just rant for a minute about that. IRA has got big subsidies for wind and solar, if wind and solar are already the cheapest way of generating electricity, which they are, why are we subsidizing it? There's 60 billion or something like that in tax credits for those. We should do away with that. And that'll make a lot of people who started businesses in wind and solar mad, but it doesn't make any sense. Research. There's a whole research pipeline coming from the very fundamental understanding of materials, of radiation, all the way through to more applied work, and then on to demonstration. And we need to more thoughtfully curate that pipeline. As I go around the national labs for the DOE, which I continue to be exposed to, they're wonderful institutions. I think there is a reasonable management of that. The universities have a little bit of a harder job in that because most faculty, though not all, just tend to the early part of the process. But I think a more deliberate curation, shepherding through might, in fact, get us to viable technologies better. But, the acid test in the end is this economically competitive with other technologies, and does it scale? And I know at some point it'll be good to talk about fusion, but fusion's got that problem right now. Nobody knows what the economic cost is of a fusion power plant because we haven't been able to build one yet. But eventually we will. But money in the end is everything, and that's not on the minds of university or even national lab researchers most of the time.
Hey, Steve, I guess that's a good segue. I was going to say, we kind of got caught on this op-ed a little bit about the Paris Accord, but I think that was a great place to start. But something you've been looking at is fusion. So maybe talk about what you're doing there, how it's practical. People hear fusion, and I think they kind of back up and say, what does this mean? How much is this going to cost? What is it? Maybe kind of tell us what it is, what you're doing there, and maybe why that might be practical at some point.
Yeah. So at the basic level, there are two ways to get energy out of the nuclei in atoms. One is to take big nuclei and release energy by breaking them into pieces, and that's fission. And right now, 19% of the US electricity comes from that process in the nuclear reactors we have. But there's another way, and that is to take two small nuclei and fuse them together, make one larger nucleus, and that is fusion. And in fact, that's what runs the stars, not fission, but fusion. The problem is that while we humans have been able to make fusion happen on Earth, we can't control it. The way we've made it happen is in nuclear weapons. And that's just an explosion, and it releases a lot of energy, but it doesn't do any good in the sense of providing practical energy for us. And so the challenge is to create a device where the conditions are such that this fusion, this coming together of nuclei can happen and release energy in a controlled enough way in order to, let's say, make electricity with it. If we could do that, there's plenty of fuel. It turns out that the radioactive products are much more benign than what fission produces. And the risk of perverting the technology into a nuclear weapon is much, much less than it is for fission. So all of those are good things. The problem is it's really hard to do. We have been pursuing for 60 years, no more, 70 years, a way to try to do this. One involves confining the nuclei. They have to be very hot and dense, confining the reacting nuclei in magnetic fields. The other way is to just squeeze them all together for a nanosecond or two, and they'll go off, they'll fuse, release a lot of energy, and then fall apart. The first is called magnetic confinement. The second is called inertial confinement. On the inertial side, we've had some recent success. At Livermore, they have been able to use the giant laser to squeeze a very tiny amount of hydrogen and get more energy out than went in to the target. And I'm proud to have a personal connection to that. In 1995, I chaired a National Academy study that said, go build that big laser. We're not sure it's going to work, but we're pretty sure. And it took 30 years or so, but I'm particularly proud and happy that we got that far. On the magnetic side, we're investing a lot in a big international project called ITER, which is being built in the south of France. And that might come online in a decade or so, and the hope is that it will also produce more energy out than in. But, those are very far away from actually having a working power plant, never mind economical. I think a working power plant is probably at least 15 years off. There are challenges. I could go through what they are, but I'm not sure we have the time. There's a lot of private sector ferment, the result of the Livermore achievement. Most of those startups will fail, but one or two might actually get to the point where they can at least make energy. But then the question is, can you do it economically compared to the alternatives? It's an investment for very patient capital, if I could use the financial term.
Maybe I'll jump in and extend this theme of sort of new technologies. And so, I kind of share your vision of it is really energy abundance for all, and especially the other 6, 7, soon to be 8 billion people on Earth that they're going to be solving for, whether we think they should or not. That is what they're going to be solving for. These are independent countries in this modern age we live in. I look at a place like India. If they simply have half the level of oil penetration in some future, we can say it's 40, 50 years from now, that South Korea does, or Canada does, or the United States does, you're talking a massive amount of implied oil demand. I think they're going to be very motivated, since they do not have apparently a lot of crude oil, to try and figure out other technologies to use. You just mentioned fusion. Are there a handful of technologies that we may not know the exact timing? You mentioned fusion looks like it's still pretty long term. That does get you excited in a world that that we're going to be entering into?
Yeah, we can make, if you want to talk about oil and transportation particularly, we can make vehicles that are much more efficient with today's technology. Lightweighting, hybridization is wonderful. You can go to plug-in hybrids. These are all available now. It's a question of cost and acceptance. And you could cut the gasoline demand in the US in half if you just improve the vehicles. So I think working on the vehicle side, in particular for oil, is something we can and should be doing. And as we see more and more vehicles in India, if it goes that way, hopefully they'll be at the 40 mile per gallon, if not larger. All right, it's we in the U.S. who have, if you like, perverted efficiency to drive big automobiles rather than more efficient ones. I'm guilty. I have at least one large car. But
Dr. Koonin, one thing in your background, you obviously were at DOE and you understand so much of the Washington complex. This notion of a National Energy Council sounds very interesting and very necessary, because energy and permitting and environmental impact, all that stuff cuts across a number of jurisdictions. Is that as viable as it sounds? Is that what do you think about that? What would you advise Governor Burgum about organizing that?
Yeah, I don't know if it's viable, but it certainly is a priori a very good idea. When I was in the government, one of the things that impressed me, or made a big impression, not impressed in a positive sense, was the amount of interagency coordination that was required. It's not only in energy, but if you go to defense or intelligence or anything that really matters, there are so many players, even within the government, that have equities, that you spend a lot of time, maybe even the majority of the time, trying to get everybody lined up rather than actually doing the thing. So it's a priori a very good idea. We had one of the interagency coordinators I was involved with was science and technology, not particularly energy. And it was a rather moribund. We would get together maybe once every couple of months and what's going on in your agency and so on. It was not very mission driven. I would hope that what Doug would pull together would be, and of course he's a business guy, so probably will be much more focused. Here are the problems. You do X, you do Y, you do Z, and let's see how it all comes together. So I think it's a great idea. The important players are DOE, Interior, EPA. I would say the big three that need to come together.
And you and I have touched on this. People don't realize how much DOE is so much about the nation's nuclear assets. And what any thoughts on DOE and how maybe DOE changes either, as a result of Chris's leadership or just ways in which you feel like it should change anyway?
Yeah, so just to maybe remind people or tell them if they don't know, Ernie Money's a former secretary and a good friend for many decades. He used to say DOE was about quarks, basic science, quagmires, the Cold War cleanup, weapons, and windmills. Okay. And what people don't realize when they come from the outside, like Secretary Granholm did, or Governor Perry, or probably Chris, is that 40% of the DOE's budget is in the National Nuclear Security Agency, which is about the care and feeding of the stockpile of nuclear weapons. It's about non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. It's about naval reactors for aircraft carriers and submarines and so on. And those have very little to do with the kind of civilian practical energy that we're all so focused on at the moment. So Chris will have a learning curve to come up, but he's a smart guy, and I expect we'll learn fast and or get the right people to help him. In the past 4 years, the department has drifted more and more to deployment. And I think that's a mistake, actually. Focus on up through demonstration. So there's the loan program. I'm not against the loan program. I think there is a place for it, but it's done too much too fast. And then there are just deployment funds going out the door. And I don't think that the government at all should be in that business.
So Dr. Koonin, you touched on, Mike asked you about fusion, and fusion is always one of those, super exciting, but super complicated, out over the horizon things. What are the other things you're thinking about that from a technology standpoint are on your radar? They could be nearer term or farther out, but tease us with some more tech that's on your mind.
Energy storage, particularly electrical energy storage. I'm particularly, in the end, it's all about materials and their properties, can they last, and so on. And we're starting to see in laboratories a sort of self-running laboratory where you combine the ability to, using robots, synthesize many different materials at once, characterize them in whatever properties you're interested in, and then use AI and modeling to predict the next round of synthesis and go through this loop iteratively to converge on what you're interested in. And the national labs, and I'm sure university labs, have been doing or starting to do this for not only materials, but also for bacteria, biology, microbes, where you can tweak the genome a little bit and basically run your own evolution. And I think that's going to have a tremendous impact on materials and therefore on energy storage. So I just can't wait till somebody sets one of these things running, and then a couple months later, out comes the answer. Here's this magic stuff, which is a mixture of 5 different elements in very precise proportions, and it'll make a better cathode, for example.
So this the battery world is often characterized, it seems like, at least by some, as, battery technology. It hasn't shown, generally doesn't grow fast. It takes has long time horizons to develop and then be put into use. And so that's been this impression of the battery technology. You're pointing out we can change the pace of that with computing power to test up.
Maybe. Yeah. It's this cycle of synthesis, analysis, and just go round and round in the loop, optimizing. So I like batteries a lot. Another thing I'm interested in, and I think, Maynard, we've talked about this a bit before, underground coal gasification with sequestration. There's tremendous amount of carbon that's inaccessible in deep coal seams. There are technologies to bring that carbon to the surface as synthesis gas, do whatever you're going to do with the synthesis gas, separate out the CO2 and put it back under the ground. There are a couple companies trying to get that underway, and the economics, at least they project, look really good compared to, say, C-methane reforming to make hydrogen from natural gas. So I like that one a lot. We'll see if they can get enough to do a couple demos. I think that would be potentially a game changer because there's a lot of coal in India and China.
So, Dr. Koonin, this is going to be the last COBT of the year. It kind of makes us sad. As you think about 2025, we're usually 10-year people around here, but let's tone it down for a minute, guys. Next year, what is on your radar from either a energy policy, technology, climate, like somewhere in the stew that we all watch? What's something that's on your radar that you think is very important, and maybe underappreciated for the rest of us to tune into next year?
Right. I don't know if this is underappreciated, but spending a lot of time with former diplomats and former senior military at Hoover and learning a lot from them and listening to them talk. I think this is going to be the year of energy security. There are so many hotspots going on around the world right now. Ukraine, Middle East, North Korea, competition with China, that, the chance that they all remain relatively quiet during the next year is pretty small. And that's going to roil energy markets in a way that will not be pleasant. So I think the more we can do to enhance security, and that means, again, putting the emissions on the back burner, so to speak, is probably what's going to happen over this next year.
Well, as you say, it's parting is sweet sorrow. I'm not a Shakespearean, but it's true. And we really appreciate you, and we look forward to doing things with you next year. You're such a nimble mind and such a good friend. We just got to say thank you and wish you all the best for the holidays.
Okay, and to you all the same. And as usual, just great questions, great conversation. We'll see you in the new year.
We'll see you in the new year.
Right.
Thanks, everybody.